In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you why Colossal Weapons are the best weapon in Elden Ring. This is the 6th video of our series where we go through each weapon in a given weapon category and sort of go through the pros and cons and show you how to use those weapons effectively so that you can decide whether or not you want it to be part of your build. Before I get into the weapons themselves though, I want to talk about Colossal Weapon styles of play first and what the pros and cons of that weapon group is. In my opinion, there are probably 3 main ways most players will use Colossal Weapons in Elden Ring, and the first is using a single Colossal Weapon and leaning into its 2-hand moveset and its weapon skill, and this is usually because of the enormous weight of this weapon type that it's easier to use one of these than it is to try and use 2. The second way is actually dual-wielding 2 of these and doing some sort of jump attack build that absolutely pancakes bosses, and this is a bit more difficult to pull off because, as I mentioned, the weight class of these weapons is catastrophic. They are the heaviest weight group in the entire game, so getting enough endurance in order to wield 2 of these usually means that you aren't wearing any armor or you're wearing very, very light protection, which can be hard to pull off if you can't stagger enemies constantly. And then lastly, you probably have some sort of build that uses a single Colossal Weapon and a Sacred Seal. And this is because most Colossal Weapons have high or very high strength requirements, and you can use the Claw Mark Seal in order to cast spells by using the strength stat. So if you're playing a strength faith build, then Colossal Weapons are not a bad choice because you need very high strength in order to use them anyway. Of these 3 types, I think using a single Colossal Weapon or a single Colossal Weapon with a Sacred Seal are probably the most likely because you really have to plan ahead in order to dual wield Colossal Weapons, and in a lot of cases it's just easier to dual wield something like great swords or great hammers or great axes because the weight is so much less. Talking a bit about the pros of this weapon group, Colossal Weapons, they typically have the highest attack rating in the game or close to it in most cases, meaning that you're going to have the highest possible damage numbers on your damage sheet. Now that doesn't always translate to actual damage in the game in terms of, how a weapon performs. For instance, Rivers of Blood doesn't have higher attack rating, but is arguably one of the most effective weapons in the game. But if you're just talking about on an R1 swing, you're usually going to get the most damage out of Colossal Weapons. Secondly, they have very high stance damage or stagger damage, meaning that it's very easy to stagger bosses or enemies with this weapon type, allowing you to get critical strikes or to attack enemies where they're rendered helpless. There are also a wide variety of Colossal Weapons to choose from. There are 15 in this weapon group, 10 of which are unique, so that gives you a lot of choices if you want to use Colossal Weapon. Another pro to this weapon class that I want to mention is that when you go to do a critical attack, like after you stagger an enemy or if you're doing a backstab or something like that, you'll actually trigger Assassin's Cerulean Dagger or Assassin's Crimson Dagger twice if you have them equipped. For whatever reason, I don't know if this is a bug. It's been in the game the whole time, so I'm assuming it's not at this point. But this is something that doesn't happen to all weapon classes. Colossal Swords, for instance, only trigger this once. And this is fantastic because this means you're going to get like 30 FP back and a lot of health back when you do a critical strike with this weapon class, meaning that you probably want to lean into staggering or doing backstabs if you can, because this will give you a huge advantage in maintaining your FP and health. And lastly, even though the sustained DPS of this weapon group is maybe not the highest out of all, they have the highest burst potential because of that high attack rating, meaning that you can probably get the most damage out of one swing, and you're more likely to make a one-shot build or a build that kills regular or modestly regular enemies in one swing if you set properly. The cons of this weapon type are that it is the heaviest weapon category in the game, meaning that you need a good amount of equip load in order to wield these without, fat rolling or maybe being overweight. So you have to plan for not only the high strength requirements for these weapons in a lot of cases, but also for that weight, meaning that you're going to need a good amount of endurance to use them. They also have the slowest attack speed of all weapons, which makes them not quite as good in scenarios where maybe you're outnumbered if you don't have a lot of poise, because you can get interrupted via repeated attacks. So you sort of have to plan for that and know that you're not going to just chain hits in a row. And this also makes them maybe not quite as good at setting status effects because you can't hit rapidly, even though they have very high status effect buildup per swing. Because you can't hit very quickly in a row, it takes longer to build up those status effects. Another negative of this weapon class is the high stamina consumption per swing. If you're swinging this weapon over and over, you're going to run out of stamina very fast. In a lot of cases, it's like 2 swings, maybe 3 swings depending on your stamina, and you're out of stamina. And if you mix in a block or a roll in there, then you're probably talking about 2 or less swings in most cases. And the last negative is that most of these weapons are found halfway through the game or later, meaning that if you have a particular Colossal Weapon you want to use, it's going to be a while before you actually acquire it and are able to lean into the build that you want. Moving along to the first of our unique Colossal Weapons is the Greatclaw. The Great Club has a unique R2 overhead swing that can be followed up with another and deals physical damage. It's one of the lightest colossal weapons in Elden Ring, weighing 17, and requires a lot of points in strength in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it drops from the Stone Digger Troll in Old Altus Tunnel, which isn't as far into the game as some colossal weapons. And it can be buffed with grease or other weapon buffs despite not being infusible with Ashes of War. The cons of this weapon are that it has a shorter length for a colossal weapon, though longer than some, and it can't be infused with Ashes of War. The Great Club has much lower attack rating than most colossal weapons, making it seem like a poor choice at first glance. However, despite being a unique colossal weapon, it can still be buffed with spells or other weapon buffs, allowing you to increase your attack rating much higher. Additionally, Golden Land, its weapon skill, will apply Blood Flame Blade or Black Flame Blade to its projectiles if you buff with either of these spells, making them a good pairing for this weapon. Golden Land also does 100% holy damage and increases in damage the more faith you have, making the Great Club an ideal choice for a Strength Faith build. By using the Clawmark Seal, you can still sling most spells effectively and buff your weapon. Just keep in mind that the strength scaling from the Clawmark Seal will not apply to your weapon buff damage. Even still, with 50 strength and 50 faith, you come out with a whopping 896 attack rating if you buff with both Golden Vow and Electrify Armament, which puts it up there with some of the higher damage dealing colossal weapons. And you can cast incantations to boot, like Golden Vow, which also boosts Golden Land's damage. I highly recommend you do a split strength faith build when using this weapon for the reasons mentioned, otherwise you'll really be limiting your damage and versatility. However, the other option is to use this weapon in some sort of jump attack build with another lighter colossal weapon, like the Troll's Hammer, and only invest in strength. I definitely recommend this weapon in NG Plus and beyond because you'll have many more points you can place into strength and faith to further boost your attack rating, as well as weapon buff damage and spell damage on into NG++ and beyond. The next unique colossal weapon is Troll's Hammer. The Troll's Hammer shares the default moveset of most colossal weapons and deals physical and fire damage. It's the lightest colossal weapon in Elden Ring, weighing 16, and requires a lot of points in strength and some dexterity and faith in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it's found in the Old Altus Tunnel, which isn't as far into the game as some colossal weapons, and it's the lightest colossal weapon in Elden Ring, tied with the Dragon Greatclaw, and it has very high attack rating for being such a light weapon. The downsides are that it has a short length for colossal weapons, although it's longer than some, and it cannot be infused with an Ash of War. The Troll's Hammer is in a weird spot for a colossal weapon. It does very little fire damage and the faith scaling is extremely poor, making it unlikely to be used in any sort of strength faith build. However, it does have very high attack rating for its weight, particularly when two-handed. You get about the same damage with the Sacred Infused Giant Crusher, which has the same length, better scaling, and has the option of various different Ashes of War. The Giant Crusher, though, has much higher requirements and weighs a lot more, so there are some trade-offs. Troll's Roar deals only physical damage with its shout, meaning it doesn't use any of the fire damage of this weapon for its calculation. Since Troll's Roar can be placed on many different weapons, it's better to be used on an all-physical damage colossal weapon if you like this Ash of War. Troll's Roar and its follow-up attack are both boosted by the Roar Medallion and Highlander Axe. If you really want to use this weapon, you'll want to increase your strength to 80 while meeting the minimum requirements for dexterity and faith, which is extremely easy to do. I'd suggest making a similar build to the Colossal Crusher build with this weapon that takes advantage of Troll's Roar and the double proc of Assassin Cerulean and Crimson Daggers. Or you could make a build with another light colossal weapon like the Great Club, doing dual wield jump attacks since they are much lighter than many colossal weapons. I don't recommend this weapon for NG Plus and beyond because of the poor faith scaling, and you'll have about 90% of its total potential attack rating by the time you finish New Game. Next up is the Dragon Greatclaw. The Dragon Greatclaw shares the default moveset of most colossal weapons and deals physical and lightning damage. It's the lightest colossal weapon in Elden Ring, weighing 16, and requires a lot of points in strength and some in dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it deals 30% damage against dragon-type enemies, it deals plus 15% damage against ancient dragon-type enemies, it's slightly longer than most other colossal weapons, it's the lightest colossal weapon in Elden Ring, tied with Troll's Hammer, and has high attack rating for its weight. The negatives of this weapon are that it cannot be infused with Ashes of War and is found somewhat late into the game, dropping from the Draconic Tree Sentinel in Capital Outskirts. The Dragon Greatclaw does a similar amount of damage to the Troll's Hammer, both of which are the lightest two colossal weapons in Elden Ring. However, it deals lightning damage instead of fire and is a bit longer and deals extra damage versus dragons. It also has a different Ash of War Endurer that is far better in PvP than PvE, since the best policy when facing bosses is to avoid damage altogether. The fact that you cannot change the Ash of War on this weapon and that it is so light makes it far better in a dual wield setup that places it in the offhand where it will not be used as often. Consider pairing it with the Watchdog staff, which has nearly identical requirements and scaling, has a much better Ash of War, and is only slightly heavier. The sweet spot for this weapon is 55 strength and 55 dexterity, after which point it begins to drop off a bit, but you'll still get decent damage all the way up to 80 in either of these stats, making it a good candidate for New Game Plus, where you will likely reach these numbers. Up next is the Watchdog Staff. The Watchdog Staff shares the default moveset of most Colossal Weapons and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for Colossal Weapons in Elden Ring weighing 19, and requires a lot of points in strength and some in dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it's longer than most other Colossal Weapons, it's found rather early on in Road's End Catacombs and Learning of the Lakes, and Sorcery of the Crozier, the weapon skill of this, provides an excellent ranged option with no investment in intelligence or faith. The negatives of this weapon are that it cannot be infused with Ashes of War, and it has very low attack rating for its weight. The Watchdog Staff sacrifices raw damage for a unique weapon skill that deals magic damage and tracks enemies, dealing damage at range. It's a great option for a melee build, giving you a spell-like attack that you can use when you cannot get near a dangerous enemy. This puts it into kind of a strange place because you have to decide whether to lean into Sorcery of the Crozier or if you want to focus on jump attacks with this weapon. This is because talismans that benefit Sorcery of the Crozier don't really fit into a melee build. Things like Ritual Sword Talisman, Magic Scorpion Charm, and Assassin's Cerulean Dagger do nothing if all you focus on is jump attacks, but they greatly benefit a build that focuses on this weapon skill. Note that Shard of Alexander doesn't boost the damage of this weapon skill, although it really should. The most unique thing about the Watchdog Staff is this weapon skill, so in my opinion I'd focus on that like I did in my Sorcery Sentinel build, or use another Colossal Weapon that has higher attack rating for a jump attack sort of build. Use the talismans I mentioned in order to pump the damage of this skill, and you can either two-hand this weapon or try to dual wield it with another light Colossal Weapon like Dragon Greatclaw if you wish. The optimal stat spread for this weapon is about 60 strength and 50 dexterity, which is very similar to the Dragon Greatclaw, and it scales relatively well up to 80 in both stats, making it a good candidate for New Game Plus. The next unique Colossal Weapon is Staff of the Avatar. The Staff of the Avatar shares the default moveset of most Colossal Weapons and deals physical and holy damage. It has an average weight for a Colossal Weapon in Elden Ring weighing 20 and requires a lot of points in strength and some in dexterity and faith in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it's one of the longer Colossal Weapons in the game, it has the highest potential attack rating of all unique weapons in Elden Ring, and it has 730 attack rating at minimum requirements, which is very high. The cons of this weapon are that it drops very late into the game from the Erdtree Avatar in Deeproot Depths. You cannot infuse it with any Ashes of War or change the affinity, and holy damage is one of the worst damage types late game, as some of the most difficult bosses resist it. Staff of the Avatar has incredible attack rating and has the highest potential attack rating of all unique weapons in Elden Ring. Additionally, it doesn't weigh nearly as much as some Colossal Weapons at 20 weight, and is one of the longer Colossal Weapons in Elden Ring. The downsides are that it does some holy damage, and holy damage is one of the worst types of damage late in Elden Ring, and you don't get this weapon until very late into the game, so you won't be able to use it for a very long time. Additionally, Erdtree Slam does about the same damage in a lot of cases as a jump attack, making it very situational when enemies are clumped together or versus undead. Something particularly interesting about this weapon is that you get the highest attack rating in NG by pumping strength to 80 and keeping faith at 24, which is the minimum needed to meet its faith requirements. However, if you go for 50 strength and 50 faith and two-hand the weapon, you have nearly the same attack rating as if you two-handed it with 80 strength, and Erdtree Slam does slightly more damage with 50 faith, making this the optimal stat spread if you're two-handed. This also allows you to play a Strength Faith build rather effectively using the Clawmark Seal, which gives you a host of buffs that can further boost your defenses and damage, as well as a variety of ranged options. Erdtree Slam does a mix of physical and holy damage, allowing you to increase its damage with Flame Grant Me Strength, Golden Bow, Holy Shrouded Cracked Tear, Sacred Scorpion Charm, as well as Shard of Alexander and Ritual Sword Talisman. This gives you a variety of ways to increase not only your Erdtree Slam, but also your own attack rating. Since this weapon continues to scale decently with Strength and Faith and even Dexterity, it's an excellent candidate for NG Plus and NG++ playthroughs, since you can continue to increase your damage through both of these playthroughs. Next up, we have the Rotten Staff. The Rotten Staff shares the default moveset of most Colossal Weapons and deals physical damage. It's one of the lightest Colossal Weapons in Elden Ring weighing 18, and requires a lot of points in Strength and some Dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it causes Scarlet Rot buildup with each hit, and it's one of the longer Colossal Weapons in the game. The downsides of this weapon are that it cannot be infused with Ashes of War. It drops extremely late in the game from the Putrid Avatar and Miquella's Haligtree, essentially making this an NG+ weapon. It has low attack rating compared to Staff of the Avatar and lower than most other Colossal Weapons. Erdtree Slam deals about 40% holy damage, which isn't the greatest damage type, and it has similar damage to the Rotten Greataxe, but with less versatility. The Rotten Staff is a mixed bag. On one hand, you deal Scarlet Rot buildup with each attack, and it's one of the longer Colossal Weapons, and on the other, you deal less damage than just about every Colossal Weapon in Elden Ring. Additionally, Erdtree Slam deals both holy and physical damage, however the weapon itself does not. This means in order to boost Erdtree Slam's damage, you will likely use something that increases holy damage, which does not benefit your regular attacks, unlike Staff of the Avatar. The only way I can see to use this weapon the most effectively is to pair it with a Rotten Greataxe and make a jump attack dual wield build that focuses on Scarlet Rot buildup as a secondary means of damage. This would allow you to main hand the Rotten Greataxe with a much more effective Ash of War and just forget about Erdtree Slam. Use the Mushroom Crown and Kindred of Rot's Exaltation for boss fights to increase your attack rating to that of most other Colossal Weapons. The sweet spot for this weapon is about 50 strength, though it scales well up to 80 with minimum requirements in dexterity. It does have okay scaling with dexterity, however, making it more viable for NG+ than some other weapons, though not the greatest choice. Next up for unique Colossal Weapons is Envoy's Greathorn. The Envoy's Greathorn shares the default moveset of most Colossal Weapons and deals physical and holy damage. It has an average weight for a Colossal Weapon in Elden Ring, weighing 19.5, and requires some points in Strength, Dexterity, and Faith in order to wield. The pros to this weapon are that Great Ocular Bubble, its weapon skill, does incredible damage when built properly. The negatives of this weapon are that it's found extremely late in the game, dropping from the Giant Envoys and Mikla's Haligtree, essentially making it an NG+ weapon. And it can take a very long time to farm this weapon, and holy damage is one of the worst damage types late in the game, as some of the most difficult bosses resist it. It's also the second shortest weapon of the Colossal Weapon group, and has very low attack rating for a Colossal Weapon. While initially it might seem like a terrible weapon because it has low attack rating, short range, and deals some holy damage, which is resisted by many endgame bosses, Envoy's Greathorn can be devastating if built to maximize its weapon skill, Great Ocular Bubble. Great Ocular Bubble does 100% holy damage and can be increased with Shard of Alexander, Sacred Scorpion Charm, Ritual Sword Talisman, Holy Shroud and Crack Tier, Golden Vow, your Faith Attribute, and the unique helmet Envoy's Crown. This allows you to approach 4,000 damage at 50 Faith, which is phenomenal for a weapon skill that can be fired off at range. And while Envoy's Greathorn has slightly better attack rating at 80 Strength and 24 Faith, you'll gain more damage from Great Ocular Bubble by splitting 50 Strength and 50 Faith. This will allow you to use the Clawmark Seal and cast incantations somewhat effectively, while still having 95% of the attack rating, much like the Staff of Avatar. Because you can continue to increase strength to 80 rather effectively and faith decently, Envoy's Greathorn makes a decent weapon for NG+, particularly because holy damage is much better at the beginning of a playthrough than the end, but will start to fall off in NG++. Next up we have Ghiza's Wheel. The Ghiza's Wheel has R2 attacks that leave the blade spinning, dealing extra damage and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a Colossal Weapon in Elden Ring, weighing 19, and requires a lot of points in strength and some in dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it's the second longest length of all Colossal Weapons, tied with Golem's Halberd. It causes blood loss buildup on each hit, and it's the only Colossal Weapon that does. The R2 attacks of this weapon leave the blade spinning for extra hits, which does trigger Winged Sword Insignia, Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prosthesis, and Thorny Crack Tier. The negatives of this weapon are that it cannot be infused with an Ash of War. It's found late into the game by defeating Inquisitor Ghiza in Volcano Manor. Spinning Wheel, the weapon skill of this weapon, doesn't trigger Winged Sword Insignia, Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prosthesis, nor Thorny Crack Tier, and Spinning Wheel does very little bleed buildup per hit, less than is on the weapon that's listed. Ghiza's Wheel is an interesting weapon because of its Ash of War, and the weapon itself should remind players of the Whirligig Saw from Bloodborne, colloquially nicknamed the Pizza Cutter. What's funny is that Spinning Wheel does far less damage and bleed buildup than a single charged R2 with Ghiza's Wheel. Winged Sword Insignia, Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prosthesis, nor Thorny Crack Tier will trigger when using Spinning Wheel, and bleed buildup is but a fraction of the per hit of what's listed on the weapon. This renders Spinning Wheel nearly useless. However, R2 attacks trigger blood loss much more easily than Spinning Wheel, and they are affected by these talismans and Crack Tier, in addition to the Axe Talisman making it particularly deadly. At 50 strength and 55 dexterity, you can deal over 3,000 damage in a single charged R2 if Hemorrhage triggers. If you insist on using this weapon, this is the way to use it successfully. Pair this with the Jellyfish Shield for even better results. Ghiza's Wheel has nearly identical scaling with strength and dexterity, meaning 50-50 is the optimal setup for this weapon, and it will continue to scale well up to 80 in each, making it a phenomenal choice for NG+ and onward. The next unique Colossal Weapon is Fallingstar Beast Jaw. The Fallingstar Beast Jaw shares the default moveset of most Colossal Weapons and deals physical and magic damage. It's one of the heavier Colossal Weapons in Elden Ring, weighing 21.5, and requires a lot of points in strength and some dexterity and intelligence in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it deals plus 20% damage to gravity-type enemies. Gravity Bolt is one of the most devastating weapon skills in all of Elden Ring, trivializing much of the game. It has the longest reach of all Colossal Weapons, and has very high attack rating. The downsides of this weapon are that it cannot be infused with Ashes of War, it's found late in the game dropping from the full-grown Fallingstar Beast in Mount Gelmir, and it has poor intelligence scaling. The strength of the Fallingstar Beast Jaw is easily its weapon skill Gravity Bolt, which deals physical and magic damage at range in a small AoE that staggers most enemies in one cast, and the rest in 2 or 3. This allows you to stunlock bosses and tough enemies without ever taking damage in a lot of cases, and can make the game a cakewalk if you're set up correctly like I did in my Gravity God build. Additionally, this weapon has one of the highest attack ratings of all Colossal Weapons, deals extra damage to gravity-type enemies, and has the longest reach of all Colossal Weapons. The one downside is that intelligence scales very poorly with this weapon, and you'd be better off thinking of it as a quality scaling weapon once you meet the intelligence requirements. The Fallingstar Beast Jaw scales very well with strength and dexterity, with the sweet spot being about 15 each with only 20 points in intelligence to meet its requirements. This weapon should be fine in NG+, because there is room to increase the damage by increasing both strength and dexterity up to 80, and the stagger this weapon does prevents enemies and bosses from even getting to you anyway. And the last unique Colossal weapon is Axe of Godfrey. The Axe of Godfrey shares the default moveset of most Colossal weapons and deals physical damage. It's one of the lightest Colossal weapons in Elden Ring, weighing 18, and requires a lot of points in strength and some in dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it has very high attack rating when buffed with Regal Roar. Regal Roar can AoE down packs of enemies rather easily, knocks enemies into the air, and has hyper armor that is almost unbreakable. The downsides of this weapon are that it cannot be infused with Ashes of War. It's found near the very end of the game by exchanging a Remembrance from one of the last bosses. It has the second shortest reach of Colossal Weapons in Elden Ring, tied with Envoy's Greathorn. And Regal Roar's damage buff only lasts 20 seconds and has a very long cast time. And finally, the damage does not increase with Roar Medallion nor Godfrey Icon, although it really should. While the Axe of Godfrey might seem unwieldy because of its slow casting animation of Regal Roar, its hyper armor makes it almost impossible not to pull it off. And since it knocks enemies into the air, it allows for a follow-up charged R2 rather easily that will usually finish up any regular or elite enemies due to its higher than average attack rating when buffed. You'll definitely want very high armor and poise when using this weapon if possible to make sure you can trade damage easily and just keep swinging, usually killing enemies before they can attack the second time. What's weird though is although Shard of Alexander and Axe Talisman are both useful for this weapon skill, Roar Medallion and Godfrey Icon both do not enhance it one bit. This is quite odd considering it's literally labeled a roar, but it still deals significant damage anyhow. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 60 strength and 50 dexterity, though you can continue to boost these stats to 80 and to NG+, making it a good choice for a second playthrough, particularly since you won't get this until the very end of the game anyway. It's a very underutilized and underrated weapon. I advise simply two-handing this weapon instead of using it in a dual-wield setup, simply because you need to use the R2 and charged R2 attacks after you use Regal Roar, or there's really no reason in using this weapon, and that does not take the offhand into account. Moving on to the non-unique Colossal weapons, the first one is the Duelist Greataxe. The Duelist Greataxe shares the default moveset of most Colossal weapons and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a Colossal weapon in Elden Ring weighing 20 and requires a lot of points in strength and some dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it can be infused with Ashes of War, and it has about the same or more attack rating when compared to unique Colossal weapons. The cons are that it's not found until very late into the game in Lendel Royal Capital and is missable, and it has the shortest length of all Colossal weapons, tied with the Rotten Greataxe. The advantage of the Duelist Greataxe is that it has rather high attack rating and the flexibility to change different Ashes of War, and it deals slash damage compared to the strike damage of most Colossal weapons. Slash is not a better damage type than strike in general, but it does give you another option if an enemy does resist strike damage. You'll get the most damage out of this weapon with the Fire and Lightning infusions, followed by Sacred and Flame Art and Magic, and then Cold and Keen. The Duelist Greataxe and the Rotten Greataxe lean towards the dexterity scaling side of things, making them a better option for dual wielding since they don't have as good a strength scaling as some other Colossal weapons. Consider dual wielding two of these weapons and using a dexterity scaling Ash of War like Thunderbolt or Beast Roar to give you a ranged option that scales well with dexterity. Remember that Cold Infusion still has B scaling and dexterity with this weapon, so it's still a valid option if you use Beast Roar. The sweet spot for damage of this weapon is about 50 dexterity and 30 strength, which is needed in order to wield it one-handed. You can continue to increase the damage up to 80 dexterity rather easily, and if you use Cold, you can increase strength and intelligence as well, making this a solid choice for NG+. Next up is the Rotten Greataxe. The Rotten Greataxe shares the default moveset of most Colossal weapons and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a Colossal weapon in Elden Ring weighing 20 and requires a lot of points in strength and some in dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it applies Scarlet Rot buildup with each hit, and it can be infused with Ashes of War. The cons are that it's not found until very late into the game in Ordina, Liturgical Town. It has the shortest length of all Colossal Weapons tied with Duelist Greataxe, and has slightly less damage on average than most unique Colossal Weapons. The only reason to use the Rotten Greataxe over the Duelist Greataxe, besides the fact that you may have missed the Duelist Greataxe, is that you want the Scarlet Rot buildup on it. It's not a bad trade-off really, a bit less attack rating for Scarlet Rot. However, it won't be very useful against regular enemies since they will usually die before you can trigger it, and you will likely need to use a dual wield setup in order to get this to proc more easily, since there is no way to boost the rate at which you build up Scarlet Rot besides adding a second source, or by using an Ash of War that strikes rapidly. Since there really isn't an Ash of War like this for Colossal Weapons, you're kind of locked into the dual wield route. I advise farming a second Rotten Greataxe, that way you can set yourself exactly how you want, and just like the Duelist Greataxe, this weapon scales more with dexterity than strength, making it ideal for a dual wield build. You could actually set both to Poison Infusion and trigger both Poison and Scarlet Rot simultaneously. This will allow you to make good use of the Mushroom Crown and Kidron of Rot's Exaltation, which will increase your attack power by 30% for 20 seconds, which puts your attack rating even higher than if you were a higher damage infusion. Note that setting the Bleed Infusion sets Scarlet Rot to 0, so we don't try and use it here. The sweet spot for this weapon is the same as the Duelist Greataxe at 50 dexterity and 30 strength, and if you're using the Poison Infusion, you'll want to continue to increase dexterity to 80 from here before investing in Arcane to further boost damage and increase the rate at which poison builds up, but not Scarlet Rot. It's not super important to do this earlier because unlike Hemorrhage, you cannot trigger poison a second time until it expires, so building it half a swing earlier is not a big deal. Because of the versatility of this weapon and the fact that it scales well in many cases, it's an excellent weapon for entry plus and onward, particularly because Scarlet Rot will become more useful as enemies gain more HP and become more challenging. Next up is Golem's Halberd. The Golem's Halberd has a unique R2 that does horizontal slashes rather than overhead strikes and deals physical damage. It's one of the heavier Colossal Weapons in Elden Ring, weighing 21.5, and requires a lot of points in strength and some in dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it can be infused with Ashes of War, it's the second longest of all Colossal Weapons, it deals about the same or more damage as most unique Colossal Weapons, and it can be found quite early in Elden Ring by farming golems on the path to the Divine Tower of Limgrave. The cons of this weapon are that it's one of the heavier Colossal Weapons in Elden Ring. You can't change the Ash of War on this weapon without losing Charge Forth, since you cannot put this Ash of War back onto this weapon class. Charge Forth, although hitting multiple times, does not trigger Winged Sword Insignia or Millicent's Prosthesis, and also Charge Forth does very little staggered damage. When I first started testing this weapon, I really wanted to use Charge Forth since it's an Ash of War not found or applicable to any other Colossal Weapon. However, when I started trying to optimize it, I soon realized that even though Charge Forth hits multiple times, the game only counts them as one hit and so does not trigger Bleed or Poison buildup faster, nor does it trigger Winged Sword Insignia or Millicent's Prosthesis. This was a major letdown alone, but when coupled with the fact that it does nearly no stagger damage, it became clear you could get more damage out of just charged R2s with this weapon than its Ash of War. So why then would you use the Golem's Halberd? Well, it has fantastic strength scaling, it has the second longest reach of all Colossal Weapons, and it has the versatility of being able to change Ashes of War and set status effects. What I decided to do with this weapon was actually a block counter build, and that's because it has extremely long range, allowing you to hit even when pushed back. It has very high damage, allowing you to hit very hard with block counters. It also scales well with strength, making it a good candidate to pair with a Great Shield. When you use this in combination with the Curved Sword Talisman and things like Determination or Royal Knight's Resolve, you one-shot most enemies in one block counter, but if for some reason you don't, well, you usually stagger them, and then you can trigger Assassin Cerulean and Crimson Daggers twice, due to it being a Colossal Weapon. It's sort of the apex of block counter builds. The ideal stat spread for this weapon is somewhere around 50 strength, but you can take this up to 80 no problem, and probably even higher since it has A scaling when set to heavy. Additionally, Bleed and Cold both have B scaling and strength, so are not bad options either, particularly in NG+, when enemy health pools increase. Next up, we have the Giant Crusher. The Giant Crusher has a unique R2 that causes the wielder to somersault forward and can flatten regular enemies if charged, and deals physical damage. It's the heaviest weapon in Elden Ring, weighing 26.5, and requires a huge amount of strength in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it can be acquired earlier than most Colossal Weapons in Elden Ring and Altus Plateau. It can be infused with Ashes of War. It has the best strength scaling of all Colossal Weapons and highest potential attack rating of all infusible Colossal Weapons when using heavy, cold, blood, or poison scaling. And it has very good physical damage reduction and guard boost, making it decent at blocking in a pinch. The cons of this weapon are that it has short length for a Colossal Weapon, though longer than some, and it's the heaviest weapon in Elden Ring. The Giant Crusher has outstanding attack rating as well as a unique R2 that can flatten enemies. It has the highest potential attack rating of all infusible Colossal Weapons when using any infusion that uses strength in its scaling, like heavy, cold, or blood or poison. And because the Giant Crusher requires such a large investment into strength in order to use, you're better off using one of these infusions if you use this weapon. The downsides of this weapon are that it is the heaviest weapon in the game, weighing a whopping 26.5, and it is shorter than nearly every other Colossal Weapon in Elden Ring. This means you'll have to have a large investment into endurance to use it, and when added with the strength requirements, it doesn't leave a lot of room for any other points except into vigor and mind. You also need to be closer to your target, though the charged R2 has a decent amount of range. Unless you intend to buff this weapon with grease or some buff that requires low requirements like Frozen Weapon or Bloodflame Blade, I highly recommend selecting the cold infusion as it is nearly the same damage as heavy, but can also apply the Frostbite status effect, ripping off enemy HP and reducing enemy resistances. Additionally, using the Blood Infusion is not a bad option either, especially if you're using White Mask and Lord of Blood's Exaltation, since one bleed proc will effectively recoup the lost attack rating from selecting this infusion. The Giant Crusher has very high damage and excellent scaling, making it a good choice for NG+ and onward because you can continue to increase its attack rating via strength in the majority of cases. Consider using Ashes of War like Determination or Royal Knight's Resolve with this weapon, and using the Axe Talisman to take advantage of its unique R2 attack for very high damage. And finally, we come to the last Colossal Weapon, which is the Prelate's Infernal Crozier. The Prelate's Infernal Crozier has a unique R2 that is an upward swing that can launch enemies into the air if charged, and deals physical damage. It's one of the heaviest Colossal Weapons in Elden Ring, weighing 23.5, and requires a lot of points in strength and some dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it can be infused with Ashes of War. The charged R2 attacks with this weapon launch enemies into the air. It has better attack rating than most Colossal Weapons. Prelate's Charge triggers Winged Sword Insignia and Millicent's Prosthesis easily. And finally, Prelate's Charge can stunlock enemies. The cons of this weapon are that it isn't found until much later in the game by farming the Fire Pellet and Mount Gelmir. It has short length for a Colossal Weapon, though longer than some, and charged R2 attacks with this weapon deal much less stagger damage than other Colossal Weapons that are blunt. Much like other Colossal Weapons, the Prelate's Inferno Crozier scales tremendously with strength and has one of the highest attack ratings of all Colossal Weapons in Elden Ring. Additionally, it has a unique R2 that does less stagger damage in exchange for golf clubbing enemies into the air. The unique thing about this weapon, besides its shape, is that it comes with the Prelate's Charge weapon skill, which you cannot find until much later in the game. Prelate's Charge allows you to hit rapidly over and over by holding L2, which can trigger Winged Sword Insignia, Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, and Millicent's Prosthesis extremely quickly. Additionally, if the weapon is buffed with Bloodflame Blade, it can trigger Hemorrhage quite fast as well. When combined, this creates a deadly combination that can reach over 2200 attack rating, and likely higher in some scenarios, and can stunlock enemies in the process. While you gain the highest outright attack rating by pumping strength, if you place at least 25 points into Faith, you'll be able to use Bloodflame Blade, which can trigger Hemorrhage, you'll be able to buff with Flame Grant Me Strength, and you'll be able to buff with Golden Vow. When these buffs combine with the talismans I just mentioned, Lord of Blood's Exaltation and White Mask, you can hit incredibly high attack ratings by using this together. This will then buff your few next attacks, allowing you to kill enemies with R1 or R2 attacks for a little while. Because this weapon has such good strength scaling and high attack rating, it performs extremely well in NG+ and beyond, especially since you can set it to Blood or Cold infusions, both of which take portions of max HP off when their status effects trigger, and since enemies in these difficulties increase their HP, this only gets stronger and stronger as you increase the NG+. Well, that wraps up our video on Colossal Weapons. What did you guys think of the video? Did I get a lot of information there for you? What other tips do you guys have for Colossal Weapons? Which ones are you guys using? Let me know in the comments below.